Welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series, co-sponsored by the Water Resources Center and the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, both at the University of Minnesota. I am John Gulliver, and I will introduce our speaker. We are very happy to have Stephanie Hurley give today's talk. Stephanie is an associate professor of landscape design in the Department of Plant and Soil Science at the University of Vermont in Burlington, Vermont. Her research spans disciplines within the fields of landscape architecture, ecological design, restoration, and planning. Her research team designs and monitors green stormwater infrastructure in urban and agricultural settings. Her other recent research focuses on the use of landscape visualizations in stakeholder decision-making processes pertaining to the adoption of climate change best management practices. Stephanie is trained as a landscape architect via a Master's of Landscape Architecture at the University of Washington and a doctorate in design at Harvard University. But she interacted with many engineers as her thesis and dissertation were both on stormwater practices. And she publishes in both landscape architecture and environmental engineering journals. So Stephanie is a crossover specialist, which is where much of the interesting research takes place these days. Before we start, I need to ask you to open up the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen to pose any questions you might have for Stephanie. And then we will repeat the questions at the end of her seminar. Today, Stephanie will be talking about bioretention, soil media, and vegetation. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Stephanie Hurley.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, John. Thank you all for being here to listen today. We'll get right into my talk, which is on bioretention, soil media, vegetation, and maintenance, various green stormwater infrastructure research projects in Vermont. I am going to dig right into bioretention as one of the subjects that I research and the main subject of today's research and presentation. So bioretention is and has been defined for a long time as a landscape depression used to slow, infiltrate, and treat on-site stormwater runoff. Another definition from over 20 years ago, treatment systems that utilize soil, woody, and herbaceous plants to remove pollutants from stormwater runoff. So when I talk about bioretention, I just want to have a few clarifications for this talk. So sometimes we see other words like biofiltration and even rain gardens. Mostly I'll say bioretention today, but occasionally rain garden will come up. A rain garden typically does not contain an underdrain or a liner. When I talk about bioretention systems, they may or may not be inclusive of the hardscape infrastructure like subsurface drains or underdrains or impermeable liners. So I will describe the site specifics of the various projects I go through today. Another important distinction is what is soil versus soil media. So you probably saw that I am in a department of plant and soil science, and many of my colleagues and I have discussed that soil media really isn't the same thing as soil. Soil forms via geologic and weathering processes, including biological processes. And when we talk about soil media in a bioretention system, it's something that's brought in, it's imported from some other location, typically, unless you have naturally high infiltration rates in sandy soils on your site. So we're really talking about an engineered soil with a functional purpose, soil media. And I'll use media repeatedly throughout this talk. Also, I think it's really important to remember that bioretention, even in these two original definitions above, is intended for both the hydrologic function, managing stormwater runoff volumes and flow rates, as well as water quality functions and filtering out pollutants, also called treating the stormwater runoff. So a lot of this is already known, probably by this audience listening in. Why bioretention? It's a popular or increasingly popular form of green stormwater infrastructure, but there are still a lot of questions that remain. So some of the questions I will get into today is whether bioretention works. Does it meet the hydrologic and the water quality goals? And if so, and how? What are the optimal soil media and vegetation designs we should use in bioretention systems? And what are the barriers to implementing bioretention systems? Why don't we already see them widespread across the landscape? So for today's talk, I'm breaking down my past work in a summary of 3 sections: bioretention research in the field and laboratory, and I'll get into some of the science that my research group has had funded to look at bioretention systems, in particular nutrient dynamics, soil amendments, including discussing compost, as well as drinking water treatment residuals and vegetation growth. And then I'm going to shift into case studies where there's a way to sort of tell stories about a few projects I've had built and some of the aesthetics, maintenance, and vegetation choices that pertain to this stormwater audience. And lastly, I'll have a short section where I will mention some highlights from 2 different surveys that have taken place in Vermont, one of Vermont residents and one of municipal officials, looking at willingness to adopt aesthetics and maintenance of green stormwater infrastructure. So, zooming right along, I will just get right into part 1. So, the University of Vermont Bioretention Lab was constructed in 2013, and it's still active. I've had now 3 PhD students work on dissertation chapters and publications based on research in the laboratory, and worked with different colleagues on different projects through various funders to study. This is an aerial plan view where each of the bioretention cells is a rectangular numbered box in the image. There are 8 bioretention cells on either side of the roadway, and the polygons you see are varying road watershed sizes. So the bioretention cells are the same size and dimension, about 4 feet by 10 feet on the surface and about 4 feet deep, and then have different amounts of water in various storms flowing into them. So in addition to the natural variation in the road watershed sizes represented by these polygons, we also have exposed these systems to varying precipitation regimes, including adding more runoff and adding more rainfall than would have in the first place arrived in these bioretention cells. We've also looked at 2 different plant species mixes, high diversity species mix and low diversity species mix. And we have a soil media treatment in the original study comparing soil media with and without this sorptive media, a proprietary material that contains iron and aluminum-based additives with the focus of sorbing phosphorus. So I'm in Vermont, in the Lake Champlain Basin, and phosphorus is a major pollutant of concern here. So one of the water quality goals that we've had in my research is to explicitly target phosphorus and removing it via biofiltration, bioretention. So looking at these same cells in cross-section, these profile views, on the left side in image A, you see the sort of typical bioretention cell where we have in the upper layer about a foot of 60% sand and 40% compost. And then what I'll call pure sand layer for another foot, followed by 3 inches of pea stone, small diameter, and then larger diameter gravel and an underdrain. So we use ISCO auto samplers to capture and sample the influent runoff from the road through the curb cut, and the effluent comes through this perforated underdrain, and we sample at the outflow. The second image here just shows that in 2 of our bioretention cells in the original study, we put sorptive media, a 3-inch layer of this proprietary material to try to trap phosphorus, displacing 3 inches of sand from the first cross section. Now looking at the hydrology, remember the hydrologic goal is really critical. We've seen, this is just samples of various storms. We've taken more than 800 samples in 2 years of research, and then a previous 2 years of research with a similar number of samples. But select storms, we see the inflow is the red line and the outflow is the blue line. So the classic inflow with flashiness, really high velocity flow rates coming into the system, and the outflow has some sort of more gentle bursts of water coming through the outflow, but mostly a pretty flat line. Our peak flow attenuation is consistently 90% or more as a median, and then volume retention is generally pretty high as well, where 31% of the storms in this particular paper were completely captured by the bioretention cells, meaning that water came in through the influent and didn't ever cause outflow to take place in the bioretention. So now we get into the water quality, which is a different story altogether. We'll look at all different parameters of water quality in my research, but today I'm just going to focus mostly on phosphorus and a little bit on nitrogen. So in the upper figure here, you see the two different plant mixes. High diversity is the darker bar, low diversity is the lighter bar. But what's really important, if you can focus in on the y-axis, as all these negative percent removals. Negative removal meaning leaching. Effectively, there is more going in than coming out. For the bottom, conventional media versus that proprietary sorptive media, you will see, so phosphorus absolutely in large ranges in both the total and soluble reactive forms is coming out in far greater amounts from these bioretention systems than what came in from the roadway. This only varied with, and this is actually close to 100% removal with the sorptive media in the positive range for phosphorus removal. So really important to recognize that these are not functioning as they're supposed to. And the soil profile design that I showed in the previous slide is actually based on a recipe from the older version of the Vermont Stormwater Manual and many other stormwater manuals that you see across the United States. Nitrate is also a consideration. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today, and it actually is maybe better shown in this second figure. The previous figure was the first 2 years of study. This figure is the second 2 years of study, so 2015 and 2016 data. I had hoped the phosphorus issue and the nitrate issue would have sort of washed through in years and years of monitoring. This is now up to the 4th year of monitoring, and you can see the nitrogen species coming in to the bioretention cells versus coming out, and the phosphorus species coming in versus coming out in this figure. And this is, again, over a wide number of samples, over 800 samples included in these papers. So the culprit, you probably have guessed, that top layer inclusive of 40% compost. Out of concern for the lack of function of these systems, my research group then sought other funding from the state of Vermont to look at different forms of compost and based on their feedstocks, distinguish whether all types of compost are going to cause these problems. This is just one figure from that paper on nutrient leaching from compost. On the left side of the figure, you can see compost samples A through E, where in the laboratory, we took compost made of different types of feedstocks and exposed them to water for from 10 minutes to 24 hours, 5 days to 10 days, where 10 days would be long periods of standing water, like a flood level condition. But right away with this white bar, you can see all the composts immediately spiked in phosphate levels, and that's the dissolved form of phosphorus that we're mostly concerned with for downstream eutrophication. These two were bioretention mixes, including compost as well as sand, and actually F here was the mix that was used in the bioretention laboratory that I just shared with you. So this was the level of compost concern for the mix of 60-40. And this was with a low phosphorus compost I'll talk about momentarily. So recommendations from that paper are to remember that not all composts are created equal. We often just say compost, but in fact, there is quite a bit of variety in compost feedstocks. In stormwater treatment, we generally need to recommend choosing low phosphorus composts derived primarily from yard waste, leaves, and wood waste, and avoid feedstocks containing manures and biosolids, and in some cases, food scraps, or very, very much limiting the amount of food scraps that go into the feedstock of making compost. Also, as you saw in my bioretention profiles, we often mix the compost in full layers, up and down and widespread across bioretention systems, when actually the plant roots, which are often quite small when these systems are first planted, can't even reach that compost. So it's just washing through essentially for no reason. So one recommendation would be to spot apply compost, top dressing it with a trowel full of compost, maybe just right at the location where the plants are going in the first place, and then only to get the plants started. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but what I've noticed with some of the higher nutrient inflow projects is that when you have a lot of nutrients coming in, the compost actually serves more for water holding capacity. It keeps the plants from drying out, as opposed to being there to provide a lot of nutrients to get the plants growing. Furthermore, it's a bigger concern near nutrient impaired water. So if there is a nutrient impairment downstream or adjacent to the site, you really may want to eliminate compost altogether. This research has helped feed the updated 2017 Vermont Stormwater Management Manual. And there's actually, for those Vermonters out there, additional guidance in development, because even with the updates to the manual, we're having a hard time clarifying for people exactly how to test the soil mix and soil media mix and the compost portion of it, if compost is going to be used. So one project where we looked at low phosphorus compost in the laboratory, as well as a material that has high probability of being able to sorb the phosphorus, drinking water treatment residuals. So we're hoping to use residuals from drinking water treatment plants to filter phosphorus out of bioretention in the column form, as well as in an outdoor laboratory study. So just very briefly, drinking water treatment residuals are an industrial byproduct from the drinking water treatment process. They have metal oxides such as iron and aluminum, which has a high potential for P-sorption. They're also not all the same in terms of their content in a variety of ways. Here's 3 different samples from our study of DWTRs in this image. One of the things that's really important is the way that DWTRs are tested in the laboratory. You actually find, depending on if you did a batch isotherm, a low phosphorus, high flow, or a high phosphorus low flow experiment, proportionally of the 3 residuals we worked with, this one, CWD, consistently sorbs the most phosphorus, and the other 2 track much more similarly down low. However, if you look at the y-axis, the numbers, the value where the sorption kind of peters out and the curve flattens is actually quite varied. So it depends on your research method, and I can get into that more after this portion of the talk if people are interested, but just saying sort of a generic milligrams per kilograms sorption is probably not going to be adequate to describe what you're looking for in drinking water treatment residuals. So in this, we actually looked at what I'll call pure residuals, just residuals, and slammed it with phosphorus and slammed it with water. It wasn't the bioretention columns that I'll talk about momentarily. Some key differences in drinking water treatment residuals that should be known. Even though that CWD was the highest sorption, it did not have the highest aluminum content of the 3 we looked at, and it was mid-range for iron content. Furthermore, it did have the highest specific surface area. So there's a physical characteristic that's important in terms of phosphorus sorbing locations that may be a bigger driver than the previously thought content of the metals. We also want to be careful with drinking water treatment residuals because things like arsenic and zinc, aluminum, which is also here, and even manganese can be water quality pollutants. So we don't want to put so much drinking water treatment residuals that are effluent ends up picking up metals that weren't in the influent in the first place. So we looked at that in the lab in the pure residuals form, as well as with the goal of designing bioretention media to achieve both hydraulic conductivity and phosphorus removal goals. Created a column study where there's a control that looks like a typical bioretention cross-section, and then 2 different designs for incorporating DWTR, one in a solid layer and the other in a mixed layer design within this sort of sand layer here. And you'll notice it's only 10% compost and a low phosphorus compost derived only of leaf litter feedstocks. So there's 5% DWTR in the soil media, but distributed in 2 different ways. And on the first side, we have hydraulic conductivity here. Basically, the message with the hydraulic conductivity is that in the solid layer, there was a lot more divergence between the different residual types, where we got them, which drinking water treatment plant they came from, and they tracked very similarly when they were mixed together. Similarly, for phosphorus removal, there was some divergence in the solid layer, and the mixed layer really virtually identical performance in terms of sorption of phosphorus. So a couple key lessons here. There was a bigger disparity in the solid layer for both hydraulic conductivity and phosphorus removal. And then looking at the mixed layer, when you compare these bioretention columns with all the different media layers to the sort of pure DWTR in the previous, there isn't as much variety overall. So there is less variability in hydraulic and phosphorus removal performance among the types. This may be good news in that you could possibly use a number of different types of drinking water treatment residuals in your bioretention system without risking that one would be so much better than another in terms of phosphorus removal. But I don't know in terms of some of the other parameters if more or less concern exists with one type or another. And in fact, my colleagues and I now have a follow-up grant to look at 7 more. This was only 3 DWTR. So we're gonna look at 7 more for a total of 10 and compare them in the lab for their absorption efficacy. We also are taking what we did in the lab outside, and I'm not going to share results here, but we dug up 4 of the 8 bioretention cells, 2 of which will have that control design and 2 of which will have a mixed layer design inclusive of drinking water treatment residuals. So stay tuned for that future research. Another project site that I would like to share with you today, where low phosphorus compost was used in a bioretention system. We have Miller Farm at the University of Vermont. It is a farm, but we're not talking about a drainage area inclusive of crop fields or some of the more traditional sort of farm runoff concerns. It's mostly parking, grass, and driveways and rooftops. So keeping that in mind, we send the runoff to 3 different bioretention cells. If the flow is split after a shared forebay, and then we have 3 different bioretention cells with the following treatment design. First, with only one species, switchgrass, Panicum virgatum, we are comparing how vegetation versus no vegetation affects the water quality and the hydrology of bioretention with this farm site runoff. Second, we are comparing an addition of a layer of low phosphorus compost to the vegetation with vegetation without compost. So the first treatment is vegetation, yes or no, and the second is compost, yes or no, with the compost here again being low P compost. Here's what it looked like toward the end of the first field season. This is the bioretention cell with no compost. This one has no compost and some vegetation, you can barely see. And this has the compost and vegetation. And as I mentioned before, I think largely for water holding capacity, the compost played a big role in the first season. I'm going to just quickly go through, this is sort of like a month by month, that only the compost treatment, what the vegetation looked like in each cell. It started to catch up a little bit on the cell lacking the low P compost. However, in terms of numbers, we had almost identical survival, about 80% versus 84% of the plants surviving, but much, much less biomass in the cell that lacked the compost. The important thing though is the next field season, the following spring, we're far more on track. And by the following August, 14 months after the system was planted, we actually saw pretty much the same biomass among the 2 cells. They're outlined right here with my arrow on the screen. So that's what the vegetation story is in terms of the compost. In the first season of water quality data, we actually just published a few weeks ago, and one of the authors is Lisa Strassa, who is now in Minnesota, and some of you folks may know her. She did her doctoral work in Vermont and is now doing postdoctoral work in Minnesota. So here we have the bottom line is that, I know it's a very complicated figure, I'm just gonna let you know, the inflow to all 3 bioretention outflow change was significant decreases from these inflow concentrations to down here for outflow. So for total, phosphorus, SRP, total suspended solids, and ammonium. However, only cell 2, which had no compost but did have vegetation, saw a total nitrogen significantly decrease. And concerning, of course, is from the inflow to the outflow, nitrate increased significantly in all 3 of the bioretention cells at this site. Looking quickly at the soil profile in the same project, so the blue line is this cell that received the low phosphorus compost, and this is the top 16 inches water extractable phosphorus in June and in November. So you see sort of over time, this phosphorus moves down by November lower into the cell profile layer. And you see the red and green lines move up, and this is influent phosphorus that's coming off the landscape, coming into the bioretention cell and increasing the amount of the upper soil layers water extractable P. Couple years later, this is 2 field seasons later, we do have a few findings that we're still working on processing. So overall, the story is still great for phosphorus. From inflow to outflow, all 3 bioretention cells continue to have significant reductions in phosphorus content. And then we found, looking at with or without vegetation, there's a significant less SRP in the cell that has the vegetation, it's effluent. And comparing with and without the low phosphorus compost, there is significantly less total phosphorus in the cell that doesn't have any low P compost. And then just giving you a sense of a couple of years later with the fully established vegetation, what they look like. Again, cell 2 had no compost at the beginning of establishment. So if you have an opportunity to not use compost and hope that the plants will kind of catch up over time, this is a good example, at least with these relatively high influent concentrations from the farm, of not needing compost at all for vegetation to thrive. So now I'm going to shift gears into a couple of stories from bioretention case studies, and inclusive of aesthetics, maintenance, and vegetation lessons. I'm trying to go fast here to stay on time for you, so I've got quite a lot to share, and if people have questions, I'm definitely happy to respond afterward. This is a project where 8 parking spaces in a 1-acre parking and rooftop watershed in Vermont along the Mad River. 8 parking spaces were removed and replaced with about a square shape bioretention system. So the runoff from the parking lot comes off and goes through media layers. At the time this was built, we had only done the first couple years of the bioretention lab study, but immediately only used 10% compost and only in the top 6 inches. Not spot applying here, but only putting compost in the upper layer of the system. I do want to make that pretty clear. Towards the end of that field season, I don't know if you can see it, but there's some purple New England aster, and the plants are generally growing and establishing pretty well. And then we have winter. And I'm sure many of the viewers today are familiar with winter and all that it means. And we kind of watched over time, and a lot more snow than is in these pictures actually falls on this parking lot. And the particular commercial property owners do a lot of sanding, a lot of salting, and to my discerning eye, hardly any sweeping of the parking lot at the end of the season, as evidenced by this spring image. So you can see the muck between the oil and the salt and the sand and everything that's going into the system. It actually flattened the majority of the plants in the center of the bioretention cell. The outskirts still look pretty good. And so we decided to kind of watch it and see if anything came up over the course of the season. By that early fall, we still didn't have any plants in the middle. The infiltration was great. You could go out there in a storm and you could see that the water was percolating through no problem. But I got a phone call from the town saying that thriving vegetation throughout the system with a large amount of biomass was actually tied to the land use permit for the project. So you can imagine trying to make plants grow here where they really didn't want to was a little bit of a challenge. So here's the original planting plan that we used from what I showed a little while ago, with zones of these plants in the center. And what was happening was basically this whole area was just getting hammered physically from all the muck, a huge thick layer, almost like frosting on a cake, of material that was mucking up all the plants there. And so in the second variety of the retrofit that we did here, I designed a system to be scooped out, and the water would first go here with the sediment able to settle out and then kind of gently rise up into terraces on the side of the system into the plants. I call this an internal forebay. So we get the sediment capture, the water level rise. And here's what it looked like once it was constructed and retrofitted. And you can see the small plants at the side getting established, the water, and this is pollen floating on the water surface. You can see it kind of gently going up and not flattening the plants. And so we even have some images of really high water levels and then the water going down again. And I wanted to just make sure I showed that this very well vegetated system in the fall, if you can draw your eyes to these thin, sparse red twigs here, and then compare it to these lush red twigs. This is red osier or red twig dogwood, Cornoceracea. It's a nice woody plant. It works well, especially in the perimeter of these types of rain garden and bioretention systems. I'll have my audience guess at why these plants, planted on the same day as these plants and exposed to the identical conditions, have not thrived, and I'll tell you in a couple of slides what the answer to that is. So big picture lessons about vegetation selection and design. Obviously, you have great opportunities. You have opportunities for water quality improvement via filtration and other biochemical and biophysical processes. You have an opportunity to plant plants, use vegetation that increases the aesthetic value of a location. You also have an opportunity to demonstrate maintenance-friendly planting plans, which I can talk about more. And pollinator and wildlife habitat provision is also something you can provide in bioretention designs. One thing that kind of targets all three of these is massing the same species. So that means large clusters or small clusters, but many of the same plants in the same area. For aesthetics, this often is just done by landscape architects as a nice way of viewing things, especially when they're in flower, if they have foliage interest. For maintenance, if it's all kind of the same plant in the same zone, it's much easier to tell, especially early season, what is a weed. It's much easier to distinguish like what is supposed to be here and what isn't. And then furthermore, pollinators practice something called flower constancy. So they go from the same type of flower to the same type of flower, preferentially without exhausting themselves, going really far and really far to find that flower again. So it's massing is also good for the pollinators. Also, we have microclimate mitigation, carbon sequestration, and opportunities for revelatory design and environmental education. There's a longer list of challenges. So too much water, not enough water, that might be the top one. These plants need to be able to completely dry out and be completely inundated. And many of you know that. Aesthetics also can be a challenge, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So landowners and institutes and neighborhood property owners may have very different impressions about what aesthetics are good. It's hard to get plants to establish in sandy media, hence the desire for compost in some situations. Maintenance and management is a huge challenge, and that can be everything from moving trash to pruning and weeding and what needs to be done to which species at which time of year. Herbaceous versus woody species, there's cutting back for some, but you wouldn't typically cut back woody species. It's more of a pruning activity. Trash can get caught more in the foliage of some things than others. We also have competition where some species just come to dominate over others, and you can plan for that to a point. And sometimes that's a good thing, but other times it's frustrating. Including, I will also add competition by wildlife and less traditional pests. So the answer to my dogwood question from the previous slide was that the very lush dogwood was underneath the beam of a light that shined all night in the parking lot. An overhead light post was right on top of that, and all night in the parking lot it was lit, where just outside of the light beam, the deer browsed and pruned the dogwood. So that thin, sort of sadder looking dogwood was thanks to the urban wildlife of white-tailed deer. Going forward, we also want to think about invasive and unwanted plant species. If you're in the middle of pavement, you may have different or no or few seed sources compared to the middle of the lawn. I have actually at home my own rain garden, and we put it in the middle of what was previously lawn, and grass just wants to keep growing in there, and I kind of have to constantly decide if this is desirable or not and pull the grass out or not. There's lots of consideration of seasonal gardening activities, and then winter, just in general. You have freeze-thaw cycles to think about. You have sand and salt application, which I talked about, and plowing regimes. Actually, the larger plants around the outskirts of that project that I described to you, in the most recent one with the dogwood and the willows and the Comptonia, are also a way to tell the plows that something is here, because when there's so much snow, sometimes it's actually hard to see these systems. So maybe it's a reason to have larger woody material. So some other lessons about vegetation. In wet versus dry years, plants behave differently. These pictures are side by side of the same plants planted at the same time, but on the same day. However, this bioretention cell receives half or less the influent water than this bioretention cell receives. So it's, two species of plants, and they're living, but this one gets a lot more water than this. And in this particularly dry year, you can see a big contrast in how those perennial plants look. Other plants in wet versus dry years, I like to think about these certain plants as being rock star species. So this Baptisia here, for example, it's doing great and thriving, but this was a 7 species mix of plants, and there aren't that many. There's a little tiny columbine here and some anemone windflower here. plants that can kind of compete with the baptisia. The yellow flower here is called sneezeweed on this flowering species. And so it can be a rock star in some years, but in wet years, it does better than in dry years. And we're obviously not irrigating at all after the first 3 weeks of plant establishment for any of these projects. All the water they get is from the sky and from runoff. The same day that this sneezeweed was planted, we had some extra plants and we put them in a beautiful raised bed planter on UVM campus. This is not a stormwater planter. It is irrigated, it's full of compost, it receives garden-like treatment. And it's really important for clients to understand that this may not be what actually happens with this. So these 2 photos are from the same day, the plants are the same age. Obviously, this is actually 2 or 3 of them, but it's a much smaller profile for this particular species. So some plants are rockstar species, sometimes. Also, I like to plan for flowering species throughout the growing season. So early season, mid-season, late season, having flowers visible in the landscape. I think that really helps with good for pollinator habitat, good for aesthetics, good for clients to kind of always see something that's in action. And even in the low diversity species mix, we had switchgrass and daylilies, and daylilies are a long persisting flowering species. Switchgrass has attractive foliage kind of throughout the growing season, although it's much slower to start. And if people want to talk plants, let's do that in detail later, because I want to make sure I get through all my slides. Something else that you should know, and this is from when we started retrofitting 4 of the original bioretention cells to replace them with the drinking water treatment residuals soil media. So we had to pull out the plants from 4 of the 8 cells. And this is 7 years, well, at this time, so it was 6 years in since they've been planted. And one thing that I noticed was in the species that had the largest root systems, the baptisia and the switchgrass, of those that the 9 that were planted originally, they didn't go down 3 feet. They didn't go down even 2 feet in some cases. So we have this notion that soil media needs to be plant friendly and root friendly way, 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 way down, but the plant roots didn't always access those spaces. And here's sort of some roots of plants being dug up to demonstrate that down below, it's pretty much just soil. Also, that depending on the soil media that the plants are placed in, the root systems of different plants will respond differently. And then there are tree roots. These systems are lined, and the only thing that made it through of the 4 bioretention of the 8 that we dug up, we did see in one cell that tree roots had come in under the boards of the frame that held on the impermeable liner. So important to know that tree roots can make it into these systems. And I thought this audience would appreciate seeing that we also have been sampling. So when we excavated last summer to replace the soil media in these 4 cells, we did samples at different horizons. And this is hopefully going to be published in a future paper. But one thing we thought was really interesting was even after 6 years, the pea stone is virtually free of soil media from the sand and compost layers, sand and compost above. And so we saw some really clear, to the extent that you have good resolution, you might see it too, layers in all of the layers recognizable throughout the bioretention profile. Okay, the last section I'll cover in hopefully 6 minutes or so here. I want to just mention some highlights from 2 different surveys. Again, first, surveys of Vermont residents who might be willing to adopt green stormwater infrastructure, and then also Vermont municipalities. So this survey of 577 Vermont households included many questions. And some of the example questions were looking at how likely people were to adopt different forms of green infrastructure. So we'll just focus here on rain gardens and bioretention. But we also asked about rain barrels and other means of diverting roof runoff, permanent pavers, infiltration trenches, and so forth. Another type of question is what the barriers might be to adopting these different systems. So for this example, we asked about rain garden and what the barriers would be. And I will show some of the results from this paper. So barriers to adoption of 5 different practices that we asked about. And for simplicity, if you can focus on the light green bar, that's rain gardens. And so people often, residents, not required at all to put any sort of GSI on their site, said no need or no interest. Cost too much was a concern. Permeable pavers is something that a lot of residential clients that I've worked with are interested in, but the prices can be really challenging for people. But they thought it wasn't suitable on their property. They didn't have enough time or information to decide at the time that they were taking the survey. Too much upkeep, not enough space, a little bit higher for rain gardens. Don't believe it works against the rules of their property. So perhaps in a condo association or someplace where you aren't able to put this kind of thing in, and doesn't look good. And I think it's important to note that doesn't look good was pretty much down low for most of these proposed best management practices. So aesthetics is maybe not a big barrier we need to focus on with residential clients. We also took, in that same survey, we compared the geolocated places where these households occur with other data on the urban surroundings and the neighborhood and the town and the watershed kind of going up and up and up in scale, and compared people's responses to whether they had reported that their household had experienced runoff, washout, or some kinds of problems with water in their landscape. And that was a highly significant difference in yes, more likely to adopt green infrastructure if you've individually, personally experienced problems with runoff. Next high likelihood is if your neighborhood has experienced problems. If you've seen a local scale outside of your household, but within your neighborhood runoff problem, yes, very much more likely to adopt any green infrastructure system. There are also higher numbers, maybe less significant, but higher for whether you're in a city or not. And in Vermont, cities are maybe small towns in other places. I'll talk about that momentarily. Whether there's an impairment in the watershed where the person resides, and whether their town has an MS4, municipal separated storm sewer system permit, also was a slight increase in likelihood to adopt. The last piece I want to mention is a survey specifically looking at stormwater municipal officials in Vermont. So they may or may not have direct work on stormwater. It's 63 questions. We asked these in 2017, and the publication is in preparation of these data. I think the Vermont folks are pretty interested in this. So we are a very rural state. 5,000 people is what we're considering urban here for the purpose of these studies. So we have some really small towns. And a couple of things that are important to notice: of the 198 respondents representing 136 towns and someone from every county, in the rural small towns, a lot of times the person responding to the survey or people responding to the survey were town clerks or treasurers or some sort of town assistant, whereas there are more likely in the mid and urban sized population towns to be decision maker level or managers or implementers. So people that might actually deal on a day-to-day basis with stormwater or planning or land use or something along those lines. So looking at the current practices that are reported to be in place in the different towns, blue is practices in effect for all of these different practices we asked about. And red is things that are likely to be implemented in the near future. In general, the things that people have tried in Vermont municipalities are pretty conventional stormwater management approaches: ditches and culverts, detention ponds. The mid-range is things that are, if they've tried green stormwater infrastructure, it's pretty low-tech stuff like bioretention without an underdrain, things like rain barrels and dry wells and various types of trenches. And then the high-tech stuff is less likely to be on the land, and maybe people are a little bit more willing to experiment with it in the future. Note that bioretention with an underdrain connected to a storm sewer is considered sort of more high-tech in the urban areas of Vermont. Last couple slides on this, we looked at maintenance. All the different maintenance practices, these are important. These are kind of the whole list we can think of what would go into maintaining bioretention and similar type projects. So especially there's two main categories I want to focus on here, A and B, the landscaping and gardening type maintenance. So more the gardening, and then B is more like the plumbing and debris removal. C, we also asked about general maintenance practices. But in terms of the results, we asked folks who's doing these maintenance practices, and we found in the rural towns at the top, a lot of folks just said, it's not even applicable. No one does it, or it's not applicable in my town. The various practices are across the bottom here. In the more urban context, you see a lot more of in-house. You know, we do it, we have the equipment, we do this ourselves. I would call out that leaf collection is a particularly low one. Vermont has just a lot of places with sort of a back 40, and people don't have leaf collection programs, which are so important to recycle the nutrients off the roadway. And then finally, landscape visualizations. So here is a series of image pairs that were included on this survey. And for each pair, we have above a perspective view that's photoshopped to create a simulation of possible future alternatives. And then the corresponding profile cross-section view. So people had a sense of what we meant was going on underground with each of the 4 different things we asked about. And we asked municipal officials to say what the visual appeal from a scale of very appealing to very unappealing, and the ability of towns to maintain, from very able to maintain to very unable to maintain, for all 4 of these image pairs. The visual appeal of all of the bioretention type systems ranked much, much higher than the conventional storm sewer system, which simply had an inlet and a catch basin. Really, the visual appeal was not a focus of concern for the folks taking the survey. It was generally somewhat to very appealing, all this green that you can see on this figure. Perceived ability to maintain is a different story. And you see an increasing ease of maintenance for the conventional versus the perennial bioretention system and the treed, grass and tree bioretention system in particular. One thing I think is important to note in the further analysis that's gone into this paper that I'm not discussing today, though, is most of these greens for the bottom 2, the ease of maintenance tended to be the mid and urban size category of Vermont municipalities. So they're much more comfortable with the idea of maintaining this than the small towns, some of which don't actually have conventional storm sewer infrastructure at all. They don't even have pipes under the street. So it was all of this seemed like a big leap for the smaller towns. So really thinking from the rural to urban gradient is an important lesson here. And there's still a lot to overcome with the maintainability of bioretention in various forms and plant species. So here is a list of references of some of the papers that have already been published that I mentioned in my talk today. I hope that is useful to you, and I do have plenty more to say, as you can probably tell, but I most importantly want to thank everyone from Minnesota for inviting me to speak today, and then thank all my collaborators and thank the audience for listening in. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we have some time for a few questions. I'd like to start with the highest ranked question. You can ask questions if you want, and you can rank them with a thumbs up if you want. So Jennifer Elhert asked this question: could you go into more detail regarding the high diversity versus low diversity plant mixes that was listed on some of the early slides, and why that may have had a difference on the phosphorus effluent?
Yes, okay. So in terms of the phosphorus effluent, I'm not exactly sure what the plant diversity had to do with it, except I think with the low diversity mix, the root coverage was a lot more aggressive right away. So I do think there was probably a larger factor of plant uptake in the low diversity species mix. There may be other factors related to biomass happening there. I think that, I'm not going to go back to the slide because I'd be kind of clicking and clicking. There were other factors actually pertinent to that research, but specifically the high and low diversity, the idea in the first place, in that study, we also looked at greenhouse gas emissions and whether they occur in bioretention cells. That's a separate paper. It may have been the references I showed. I didn't have a chance to get into that. We wanted to look at the grassier species. C4 versus C3 species have different abilities to uptake CO2, potentially. We don't know for sure in bioretention systems. So that was part of the original hypotheses of having the 2 different species mixes. I think if you recall those figures for the total and soluble reactive phosphorus, negative removals of 200% versus negative removals of 400% are both terrible. So I can't say that it was so significantly better to have the low diversity mix. The soil media was a big driver for the water quality data for that. I hope I got to all the points of that question. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you. So Okay. Mike Trojans says that since it looks like vegetation catches up in no compost system after a few years, would a starter fertilizer be a good choice in a no compost system?
So my opinion about that is a no compost system. I would probably not do a starter fertilizer because I don't think what we need is like liquid nutrients or powdered nutrients to give the plants the burst. I really feel from that study, as well as my own personal rain garden at home and the project in Waitsfield, that the compost's main role early on, especially in a more high nutrient influent context, like the farm where I showed that research, the compost was holding water. The compost was helping those plants establish. The year of establishment, 2016, was a super droughty year, and you just wanted to water them. We made a rule, not after 3 weeks, we weren't going to keep watering, but we just wanted to keep watering the plants because they were drying out, but the compost was actually holding water in that context. So I wouldn't say a fertilizer as an alternative. I am aiming in the no compost at all direction, or spot applying it just where the plant roots can actually get to it. And then what is your type of compost? A low phosphorus compost with 100% leaf litter, no food scraps, no manures, no biosolids. That's actually, the feedstocks are more critical. And I did want to mention this, and I skipped over it earlier, but as I said, no composts, or not all composts, are created equal. This is also true of topsoil. And I think a lot of this, the folks who work with state manuals all the time, and Minnesota has some really good typologies for different composts and recommendations for media for different contexts. So I've been referring to that manual. I have been involved in projects where the topsoil that someone got, in order to not have such a rich bioretention media, actually came from a company that produces compost. So they sold them a compost-laden topsoil, which most like home gardeners for their lawn would probably be thrilled with because they got like a really nice high nutrient compost. But when you think of topsoil, you often don't think of something as rich as this. So to be careful with the terminology. Not all drinking water treatment residuals are the same. Not all compost is the same. Not all topsoil is the same. I hope that's a helpful addition.
Have you considered other media besides compost to retain water as long as there are a lot of nutrients coming into these rain gardens?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm sure peat is on people's minds, but I don't think on the whole it's sustainable. And I haven't used it myself in my research projects or in my consulting. I think wood chips has a lot of potential, and I didn't really get into the nitrogen story for the farm project, but I think having a carbon source to promote denitrification may also help with the nitrate in the effluent. And so something that is much slower to release nutrients and that can hold water, especially during plant establishment, is really critical. We've hardly lost any plants because of a lack of water in the years after the year that they were established. But I think some sort of the water holding capacity is really key there. Wood chips, better than any kind of shreddy mulch. You do have to watch for floating in any kind of wood-based mulch material. Somebody may have caught in my slides that you see these like grates in subsequent images from the Waitsfield project that kept the wood chips out of the overflow. So all these materials are really important to consider, and I'd love more input, but I'm definitely not sold on many things yet. But low phosphorus compost, I really feel like is the key. Getting the clean leaves and getting them in a compost blend that is appropriate for bioretention, and then only where it's needed, not all throughout the profile. There's no point in having compost where plant roots can't access it.
The next question. Do you have an example operation and maintenance plan for the built systems that define people hours per year, items to examine to determine acceptable annual performance?
Yes, I do. I have a few. I have maintenance plans for the majority of my projects, and also sort of a menu that I worked on when I lived in Seattle, actually with the city of Seattle, for potential maintenance ranges from a service level of A to service level of F, including maintenance for the landscape versus the hardscape. The first part of your question, can you repeat the first part, John, of that question?
Sure. Do you have an example O&M plan for the built systems, which I think are bioretention systems, that define people hours per year, items to examine to determine acceptable annual performance? So that would be visual inspection.
Yeah, so that part, yes. The people hours per year is super site specific. I think it's important that every client, every entity that sort of owns this infrastructure figures that out. It's very different sending somebody out for the day to do sort of like mowing versus pruning versus weeding versus simple visual inspection. And I think if someone, I know that there were some questions sent in advance of the webinar, and there was one asking about sort of the minimum number of visits per year. And I think if you have regular inspection, and maybe that includes checking to make sure the inflow isn't clogged and the outflow, if there is one, isn't clogged. If you could do that once a month and then do all the like garden stuff 3 times a year, spring, mid-season, fall, that's a bare minimum, but I do think you can't really get away without more frequent inspections.
Okay, this is the last one we're going to do before we break, before our panel discussion. Any related performance observations or recommendations using iron-enhanced sand in vegetated bioretention practices?
I haven't worked with iron-enhanced sand. There is literature on it, and my graduate students are citing it in their literature reviews. I think, you know, there's a few different studies that look at all kinds of more affordable and cost-effective media amendments. So drinking water treatment residuals, unless there's a big sort of run on these materials, are relatively cheap or free or sometimes donated because there's something as a waste product that needs to be disposed of. With the sorptive media that I showed in the original study, is very, very expensive proprietary material. It worked really well. It was a gangbuster phosphorus sorber, but it's not appropriate from the financial standpoint for repeat application. I have seen some good things on iron-enhanced sand. I believe also somebody was asking about biochar in some previous questions, and I think maybe it could have a role in the nitrogen story, but like compost, water treatment residuals, topsoil, not all biochar is created equal either. And I think it's maybe more because of the carbon source going to relate to nitrogen removal than phosphorus removal. I haven't really seen good literature on that. So if someone sees anything on phosphorus and biochar, please send it my way. The iron-enhanced sand question is good. Maybe it's like the next frontier in terms of more amendments we might consider in bioretention.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to unmute everybody, and we can show our appreciation for Stephanie's seminar with some applause.
Welcome back. We are now ready to start our panel discussion. My name is Andy Erickson, and I am a research associate at St. Anthony Falls Lab and the University of Minnesota. I will go through and introduce our panelists today, and I will ask each of them to give their relation to the topic. Hopefully on your screen, you can see all of the panelists live. If you cannot, check on your computer or on your tablet or phone for a button to change from speaker view to gallery view. If you are in gallery view, you should be able to see all of us. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Our first local panelist is Peter MacDonagh, who is the Director of Design and Science at the Kestrel Design Group and an adjunct faculty in the Landscape Architecture and Architecture departments at the University of Minnesota. Peter, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to this topic?
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Stephanie, for an excellent presentation. I particularly like the emphasis on looking at compost, which is the most common default rain garden mix in media. And I was interested in a few things. One is the idea of spot applying compost and I'll let you answer this in a moment, but I'll just finish up. Do you put it in the planting hole alone, and then it's surrounded by the sand media. The next one is making the distinction between high carbon, low phosphorus feedstock in terms of yard waste and lawn clippings and leaves as the source. And then the other one that I thought was very interesting is the use of a no compost and a compost mix, and how the switchgrass over a 14-month period didn't do very well at first, but over time caught up. And I imagine that's the stormwater inputs from phosphorus, nitrogen, et cetera, coming in that's doing that. But it seemed that you thought that maybe there's not enough benefits to doing no compost in terms of plant vigor, and I'm wondering if weed invasion is an issue too, if you do no compost in the mix. And I also appreciated, as a plants person, your emphasis on the rock star. That's a new one. I like that a lot. Rock star plants, the baptisia, the sneezeweed, the New England aster. You mentioned Canada anemone, but I don't think it made it into your rock star category. You showed switchgrass, and I wanted to leave you with this question. Is switchgrass one of your rock star plants too? Thank you, Stephanie. Great job.
Great, thank you, Peter. Our next panelist is Kate Brauman, who is the lead scientist at the Global Water Initiative and the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota. Kate, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to this topic?
Well, I was really excited to see the really nice data that Stephanie is pulling out of this. I spent a lot of time working with modelers, both in an urban context, but also in a larger watershed, sort of less intensively managed context. And a lot of the time what I see is that, especially on the modeling side, people really assume these things are good. And maybe they're a little more good, or maybe they're a little less good, but we're definitely getting benefit. And so really what the modeling is focusing on is the connectivity between the sites and thinking about how it adds up. And I think I was really intrigued to see, for example, that some of these are actually have more nitrate and phosphorus coming out of them. Those are the things that we don't see. You know, you see when the bioretention plots aren't doing the flow regulation, but we don't see what's coming out the end. But if we're doing models and we're making management decisions based on assumptions that are not correct, we're going to be wrong at the big scale, and we're not going to see the kind of outputs we want to see in Lake Champlain and all these Minnesota lakes. So I was just delighted to see this, and I would love to hear more about some of the maybe counterintuitive findings. And I was really delighted to see that this is going into some of the guidebooks and guidance for what's getting put in.
Great, thank you, Kate. Our next panelist is Rusty Schmidt, who is a landscape ecologist and a division lead at Nelson, Pope, and Voorhis in the greater New York City area. Now you might ask, why is he a local panelist? Well, many of us consider Rusty a local expert because of his many, many years of service here in the stormwater Minnesota, the Minnesota stormwater industry. So Rusty, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to this topic? Rusty, I think you're still muted. Let me unmute you. Try that again.
Oh yeah, there we go. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, thank you. And I gotta say, I gotta reiterate what both Kate and Peter said, that I really did enjoy a lot of the conversation and presentation and really putting data behind everything. So that was really good. What I do is try to continue to learn from this data experts and actually put it in daily in the field with real projects. And so I guess my experience is probably putting in the infrastructure, and then putting in a maintenance plan, and then watching it for years to come. And one of the things that I've been doing lately has been helping out New York City parks and Department of Environmental Protection to really take what we've learned in Minnesota and install it in New York City itself. So that's the other piece to it. What I really would like to hear more on, along with what Peter has already added, I'm not going to reiterate those things, but I really am interested in the thought process of putting in the layers versus putting in the additives in a mixed form. I thought that was very interesting and something that I'm going to start using.
That's great. Thanks, Rusty. We just had about a 30 to 40 minute reaction or relation to the topic from Stephanie, so I won't ask her to do that again. Let's just jump into questions. Now, many of you received an email and were allowed to submit questions prior to the seminar. I got good response on that, so I'm going to start with some of those questions because they actually relate directly and continue the discussion that we've started here today. So the first question I want to start with is this idea, there's several questions around compost, and Peter reiterated this as well. And one of the questions that was submitted is why do we need compost and bioretention media at all if it's known to release phosphorus? Is there a better substitute? And in what situations, perhaps, should we use compost and maybe not use compost? Stephanie alluded to some of these in her presentation, but I'm curious to see what our local panelists from their experience have to share for this too. So for the panelists, if you have an answer for that, please raise your hand and go ahead and we will unmute you.
Okay, I'll go first.
Go ahead, Rusty.
Okay, so yeah, so what I've been doing with compost is reducing the amount and doing less and less and less. At first, when we first started doing this, it was all 70-30 mix sand or sandy loam with a compost. And what I've been seeing over time, and this is all anecdotal, is that I've been really seeing that I've been getting down to only 10 to 15% compost, enough to get the plants going and really taking off, and nothing more than that. So that was one of the things that I've been doing with compost, and I like the idea of using some other additives.
Peter, did you also have an answer for that? Go ahead, please.
Well, one of the things that comes to mind is what Stephanie mentioned, is that compost, it has become a default because it's an inexpensive and very available media. And so I would like to hear some of her thoughts about maybe some other media, but expense being an issue and being a barrier to some of these rain gardens going in, or bioinfiltration projects. And I think the idea that you're going to piggyback off of the nutrients that are imported into the system consistently and just use compost to get the plants established, I think is a very innovative way of looking at it.
Does anybody else want to respond to that question of compost and ratios and when to use it and when not?
I'll just ask a question, which is, Stephanie, I thought I understood from your presentation that you were hypothesizing that the compost more than anything was about the water holding capacity and not actually about the nutrients. So that would obviously change the calculus for what you might replace it with.
Yeah, I think that if you can hear me, I'm not sure.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, Kate, to agree with what you were saying, I think my hypothesis is that, but it is a hypothesis. I haven't fully been able to test it other than at the farm site, but we had the influent nutrient concentrations are about double for total nitrogen and about 10 times for total phosphorus compared to what we typically see on average in urban settings. So I feel really comfortable in that kind of setting, not having any compost for a nutrient benefit. But I think, again, like even in terms of terminology, just saying compost is not adequate. We need to specify what the compost feedstocks are or were, where it's located and how much proportionally. I really think I can't say enough that if the plant roots can't get there, why is there compost there? And if the plant roots don't get there, maybe they could, but they're not. So it's really not there is a way to trap much. I do want to be more familiar with research on heavy metals in particular, because there have been phytoremediation studies where compost helps in metal trapping. So I don't want to rule it out in every scenario. One last thing, well, there's more than one, but I'll say one. An important factor is this underdrained? If it's completely infiltrating and you're going to an area where the native soil has natural absorption capacity, loamy, or it's literally not underdrained, it's not like a high density location or with a high water table, maybe it's less of a concern, right? So I have a goal sometime in the next year or so, creating a decision tree about this, where like, am I in an impaired watershed? Am I in an impaired watershed for phosphorus or for nitrogen? And is it a system that's going to be underdrained where the effluent is going to a wastewater treatment plant in a combined sewer system, or whether it's going to separated storm sewer with no more treatment? There's all these factors that should be weighed in. But as a sort of general blanket statement, I will say, question the amount of compost, the type of compost, and where it's located in the system.
Yeah, go ahead, Rusty.
I have also, the Minnesota has a great reference of what compost is being used. That is not actually being used anywhere else in the United States as far as I have found yet. And that is that compost has to be that type 2 compost, leaf matter. It can't have any animal products. And so in Minnesota, that is one thing I do want to add, is specifying the correct compost is vital. And we already have a specification by MnDOT for that.
Go ahead, Kate.
Stephanie, I love this idea of the decision tree. And I encourage you to find time to do it, because this is something that I've seen a lot of potential users wrestle with, that they actually haven't really thought through what their situation is and what outcomes they're interested in. There's obviously a desire for not just win-win, but win everything. We can fix flow and nutrients and heavy metals, and we'll just put this thing in and it'll solve all our problems, which we're seeing more and more is not always the case. And so working with people who might potentially install these to really understand what is it you're trying to control is something that we found is really critical.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, actually, if I can just, since Kate was speaking, I wanted to jump on, and I didn't say it, but her earlier observation that so many of these modeling assumptions, you just sort of like check the box for bioretention. I mean, it may be a little more nuanced than that, but and I've been involved in modeling. I have some papers for my dissertation on that, and I'm very reluctant that we can trust a model that just says, like, if bioretention goes into 20% of the watershed, we're going to have this kind of outcome, when bioretention isn't consistently performing. And I'm not the only person who's found variability by far. I mean, you had Alan Davis a few seminars ago, and I was trying not to repeat what he said, but we've got similar findings over and over, and many other people across the country. So I really think that questioning the simplicity of models, the hydrology is pretty good. Like, I feel pretty comfortable that the hydrology estimates in the 80+ range are trustworthy. But I think for water quality, it's really all over the place.
So yeah, go ahead, Peter. You want to add to that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that you mentioned, Stephanie, in an aside near the end of your presentation, was investigating wood chips as another amendment. Again, an inexpensive, you also made the distinction between chips and shredded mulch. But I've seen some research where they're particularly good at absorbing heavy metals. Do you see them from the heavy metals point of view, or do you see them mainly as from the phosphorus point of view?
Actually, from the nitrogen point of view, I have a different project that I didn't get into it all today. That's actually looking at a wood chip bioreactor with several colleagues of mine to deal with silage leachate, so the stored fermented animal feed. And the leachate is very potent, it's highly acidic, and trying to create an opportunity for denitrification and reduce nitrate pollution. And the wood chips are working really well on that front. There actually have been some ancillary phosphorus findings, and we'll hopefully stay tuned for those publications. But I think that and the water holding capacity potential. There were some great questions in the Q&A I was trying to look at in the quick 5-minute break about the wood chips, and somebody did ask surface or in the mix. And I think if I was going to design a new experiment on that right now, I'd probably be inclined in the subsurface, maybe not like all the way down, but sort of a subsurface level because of the floating consideration. But then we also have to ask, is it softwood or hardwood chips? There's a bunch of other factors to consider.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Rusty.
So one of the things here on Long Island is nitrogen is our #1 pollutant. I went from phosphorus being the #1 pollutant to nitrogen being the #1 pollutant and having to rejigger myself a little bit. But one of the things that we're using is permeable reactive barriers, which is kind of what you're talking about. And we use wood chips as the primary product that we use within those barriers. And so I could see, so here I'm starting to design mostly with internal water storage and now adding wood chips in the lowest levels, and then I'm starting to test now for nitrogen, because we're trying to get a lot lower nitrogen values coming out of the bioretention systems.
So that actually, that whole discussion actually feeds into several questions, a few from the Q&A, a few from the pre-seminar submitted questions, and even one that came into the chat, thinking about these amendments and these enhancements, right? And so there's one aspect, if one of the goals is just water holding, right? What about like a hydrogel or some other product that's specifically designed for holding on to moisture? And then again, if nutrients, whether that's nitrogen or phosphorus, what other amendments? So Stephanie talked about water treatment residuals. In Minnesota, spent lime, actually, from water treatment is a hot topic right now, and aluminum-based, but also iron-based amendments. So I'm curious to see what our panelists have from their experience or knowledge or reading. What lessons can we learn from that, and what would you recommend? Who would like to go first?
That's a good question.
I know I can speak from the University of Minnesota. We've done a lot of research on iron-based amendments and iron-enhanced sand filters. So we have a number of resources and research studies on that. If you're interested in that, I'd say contact me, Andy Erickson, and I will share those resources with you. But if anybody has had other experiences, even with organic materials like peat or biochar or other things that they can share, this would be a good time to talk about those amendments and enhancements. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay. I'm particularly interested in the city of Stockholm in Sweden has got a Bloomberg grant to create its own biochar facility, and is now a major producer of that for its own needs. And I don't know if that's going to move into something else, into the private sector as well. There was a question in the questions that were asked in advance of the webinar about biochar, and I'd like to hear if you have any thoughts on that, Stephanie, if that's an area that you're going to research later, or if you already have some information you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mentioned biochar just in passing in a slew of other comments I was making to the answers to questions earlier. I haven't seen data that make me interested in it from a phosphorus standpoint, maybe from more of a nitrogen standpoint. And also, I have seen that it's not, depending on how it's made, it's quite variable. I know there's some folks working with a different material called high carbon wood ash that is, my understanding is made differently than biochar, but it has some consistent factors. And I believe that's Curtis Hinman out in Washington and he and others are studying that material. Trying to think of other materials that are worth mentioning. The hydrogel, I haven't considered. It's an interesting idea. I guess for me, I don't know with hydrogel if it sort of like disappears over time or if it's just in there. If there's issues with hydraulic conductivity associated with it, I wouldn't change to that because you don't want clogging. You definitely don't want a newly installed system to backflow. Like as soon as something floods, you're in huge trouble with whoever you're working with. So you really need the conductivity. I don't know at all if hydrogel causes that issue, but for any new material you're testing, I would think about the hydraulic conductivity / hydrology implications. I would think about what it means for the microbial community. So especially in the nitrogen conversation, does it foster some microbes that are beneficial? I think, what does it mean in terms of what it might leach? Like if we put tons of drinking water treatment residuals in, maybe it offsets a ton of compost, which may or may not be necessary in the first place, but are you risking leaching some heavy metal that is in the residuals? And if you don't want to create two problems by trying to solve one. So yeah, I think really my input would be like, go through a checklist of why is this material being proposed? What are the possible negative side effects or trade-offs involved with the material? Nitrate came up, I think Rusty brought it up a minute ago, and you talked about internal water storage zones. And I didn't have time. I had slides I cut because I knew I was going to go too long on this, but at the farm site, you saw the nitrate was really problematic in the first year of data, and then in the subsequent years, also true. We've tried to increase residence time because the valves that we use for outflow sampling actually have a closing knife gate valve that we can use. So we could hold water for 24 hours after a storm in all 3 of the bioretention cells with the low-P compost, with the switchgrass, with nothing, with either the vegetation or the compost. And in closing those valves, we were hoping we would get better nitrate and there'd be opportunities for denitrification, better nitrate removal, excuse me, and opportunities for denitrification. And we didn't see a significant difference between the year we didn't have the valves closed and the subsequent year. We're still analyzing the data. But a quick lesson is what we did see was the phosphorus came out more. So as soon as we got the standing water to try to deal with nitrate, we ended up with higher SRP leaving the system. The longer the water sat in there, with longer retention time for all 3 bioretention cells. So you're gonna pick your enemy with the nutrients.
That's really interesting. Rusty, did you want to put something in there too? I saw you raised your hand a little bit earlier.
Yeah. So Cornell Extension is doing a huge study right now on biochar on a whole bunch of different kinds and makes of it. So keep an eye out for Cornell. I would like to think that they're going to have something in the next year or 2.
Great. So maybe then, maybe I can ask this question, and this kind of came up again in both the pre-submitted questions and the Q&A as well. If we're considering some amendment or some enhancement, what, besides its purpose, right? As Stephanie mentioned, we have to think about why are we putting it in there, right? And does it achieve those goals? But maybe more specifically, what kind of things should we maybe test for that it might add negatively, right? What kind of things could it leach or release? And under what kind of conditions maybe should we test for that? There are a number of waste products from a variety of different industries that have a lot of positive benefits, whether it's removing phosphorus or doing something with nitrogen or water holding capacity. But as a waste product, it could also have a lot of negatives, including even water treatment residuals for that matter. So I guess what kind of advice would you guys give as what we should do for testing and what makes it good?
Well, so I think the first piece is understanding the hydraulics, I think, is the first piece. If you're adding anything that's going to clog it up, as Stephanie already mentioned, I think that's the first thing that we need to make sure that it's not slowing it down or clogging it up, either the underdrain or even at the surface, and start making ponds and pools. So I think that's the first thing. Then I think the next pieces that need to be considered is, are we increasing heavy metals? Are we increasing chlorides? and or the opposite if we're capturing phosphorus and increasing nitrogen or vice versa. I think those are the things that are needing to be tested. And I don't think, the reason why nobody spoke right away is I don't think anyone's really figuring that out quite yet. We're still having a hard time just getting the nutrient we're trying to go after.
And I think that's a good point. There's no standard, obviously, for this kind of testing. And like you said, Rusty, a lot of people are still trying to figure this out. Did anyone else want to chime in on that? Go ahead, Kate.
I'll just say that, you know, one thing that we do know is we often know where these amendments are coming from. So if a water treatment facility is worried about heavy metals in their primary removal, they will know that. And so if we know what to ask about, we can often get answers we need that will at least suggest what the outcome will be. So similarly, Stephanie talked about, you know, is this food waste compost? Is this just dry litter compost? Where is this coming from? Who made this? So it's obviously not a quantitative answer, but we can get actually pretty good qualitative answers a lot of the time if we ask the right questions.
And I think that's important, is asking questions, right? Where does this come from? What's in it? Has it been tested for X, Y, or Z? What has it been tested for? And even, I think for stormwater, one of the things we have to really consider is that, especially when we're considering waste products, it may not be tested under what stormwater water chemistry parameters are, right? So conditions like pH or alkalinity, things like that may be different in stormwater that are compared to what it came from in terms of its process. So those are kind of things, if we continue to ask questions and just be very, not critical, but just asking the questions to get the information and get the knowledge and do the testing to find out what is good and what potentially could go wrong, right? So in some ways, maybe it's best to be a little pessimistic when we're considering new things when we add. And it's good to do testing in a lab quickly and find those answers before trying to deploy it in the field. So I want to pivot our conversation a little bit and talk about something that can be important in cold climates. So in Minnesota, we have a large audience here in Minnesota for this seminar series, although we do have a lot of audience in Pacific Northwest and Pacific Northeast, in cold climates and other parts of the world, actually. And I want to talk about road salt and winter maintenance. And there's questions that were submitted in the pre-seminar questionnaire asking about what can we do about road salt impacts to our bioretention, and what kind of vegetation can we select specifically to maybe not necessarily counteract this or capture chloride, because a lot of times we just can't capture it, but how can we at least tolerate some of these salt loads? Or is there any pre-treatment we can do in the fall to kind of prepare our rain gardens to receive this slug of salt throughout the winter and in the spring snowmelt? So who would like to start? Rusty, please go ahead.
Yeah, so what I have noticed, and I guess I've been putting in rain gardens along roadways in the right-of-way since about 2000, I guess. And so what I have noticed is that the perennial vegetation that goes dormant during the winter time have had, and just looking at rain gardens that are 15 years old, I have yet to see any plants in the perennial side, herbaceous line, that have been impacted by salt. In Minnesota, here in New York, I just haven't seen it yet. Where I have seen impacts is usually shrubs and especially evergreens. And what I have noticed is the further back they are from the road, the less impact that they're having, depending on the speed of the road. And so what it is the aerosol form of salt, of snowplow mist, the salt mist when the snowplow goes by, landing on live buds or leaves. And so the deciduous plants seem to be about 10-ish feet away on a 30-mile-an-hour road. They seem to be doing okay. The evergreens need to go a little further. And then as soon as you start getting up to road speeds of highways, 60 miles an hour, we've all seen it in Minnesota where you've had the winter burn on our evergreens and they're 30 feet from the road. And so they need to be even further back. So that's my first take on plants with salt and then usually the other studies that we've been seeing is that these bioretention cells still work in the middle of the winter, even during the freeze. They're just not working as fast. And so the salt is kind of, every time it melts, and as soon as we get the spring rains, any residual salt that's in the soil is kind of being washed through the system. That doesn't mean that we're fixing the problem. We're just pushing it further into the soil complex. And again, not salting or ruining the bioretention soil. It's just moving on. I'd love to hear anyone else's opinion, but those are my observations.
Yes, please. Who else would like to chime in on that? Please go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Andy. I would agree with Rusty on that in terms of the impact to perennials. I haven't seen a lot of salt damage issues, and it's part of the reason why, although I do include halophytes in a plant list, I haven't felt the need to really emphasize it. But based on research that was done in Morton Arboretum, where they looked at the aerosols of salt spraying, they were finding that they were going back hundreds of feet, and it was impacting conifers very negatively. And it's been a long-term study that they've done. So it seems like I see it particularly in oaks too, that it really stunts and gets their buds much closer together, and they tend to bud out at the very tips, and you see a lot of damage to previous year's buds that they don't come back in again. I think the ultimate thing is that we need to find an alternative deicer rather than calcium chloride and magnesium chloride. What that is, I don't know, but 5 streams in Minneapolis, there are 5 streams, and all of them are impaired for chloride. And we're 2,000 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. And with a headwater state, there's something wrong with our system. We need to get an alternative deicer. I don't know what that is, but I really encourage people to do research in that area.
Yeah,
Other comments on salt? Go ahead, Stephanie.
Sure. I appreciate both Rusty and Peter's points about the chloride issues and sort of general observations about the damage to foliage, obviously to waterways. From the design standpoint, I pick only plants that are listed someplace as being salt tolerant. I haven't always like triple verified that each one is, but I find lists of plants where the salt tolerance is checked on the list. But I also think it's really an issue of more starting at the source. It's pre-wetting and using brines instead of the granular salt. Like there are ways to reduce chlorides. I'm not saying it's eliminate by better management practices. And so I do think like you can, wet roads in advance of a storm instead of after the ice has already formed, and you can use a lot less material. You can use brines. You can. The other piece I wanted to mention was in what I'm seeing with damage from salt in bioretention systems is more likely to be the visual, at least, is the hardscape, is like things that are made of metal or corroding materials, especially porous pavements. Huge problems with the pavement like crumbling and rattling. And so I think there's a lot of green infrastructure that could use help on the chloride front. I think it's a really important topic.
Go ahead, Kate. Yeah.
I have a question actually. Sanding is obviously one of the things that people talk about as an alternative. And then Stephanie, you talked about how the sand was so detrimental. And all three of you, if you've thought about strategies and design approaches, when it seems like sanding is either going to be or is something that's going to be happening.
I'll go first, I guess, again. I just realized that I'm going first every time, so I'm starting to worry. So here's my, here in New York, they don't really salt that much. They sand more, and the sand is beach sand. It's really fine sand. And so what I'm dealing with is making sure that we do proper pre-treatment structures to bioretention, which is a hard sell a little bit here, but we're trying to get them to do more and more pre-treatment so that that sand and other debris coming from up the street, leaves, seeds, grass clippings, everything else, is captured before it even gets into the bioretention. So the more we can stop and use things like the Rain Guardian or other filter structure of some sort to really stop it before it gets into the bioretention, the longer lasting your bioretention goes. So that's my first take.
Anybody else want to add to that? I think that's true. I was going to say too, so a few things, obviously pre-treatment. So in Minnesota, we require pre-treatment for all of our bioretention and infiltration practices purely for sediment capture, you know, so that prevents sanding. And we used to do a lot of sanding in Minnesota, and in some places sand salt mixes and things like that. I'll also just kind of mention, we are at the University of Minnesota doing research on road salt alternatives, so alternative chemicals, particularly organic chemicals like acetate, and MnDOT's actually using potassium acetate in a few spots just as a kind of a pilot scale and testing. So we are working with them and doing research on that to see what are the environmental impacts. Obviously, you're trading chloride for acetate as an organic, which has a BOD impact potentially. So we're trying to understand that. And there is research in other places. If you're interested, again, you can contact me and I can point you in directions and connect you with researchers and reports on some of this work that's on road salt alternatives. So with that, winter maintenance, that actually kind of leads into obviously summer maintenance, right? We actually got a number of questions on the pre-seminar submittal page about maintenance of these bioretention practices, and talking about, you know, there was questions about sediment, how do you prevent sediment clogging and things like that. And as we kind of said, we can do some pre-treatment to try to capture a lot of that sediment ahead of time. We can look at sources, which is also a remedy for chloride and road salt. But then some of the questions were more specifically about vegetation. I'm trying to get my questions up at the same time here.
You keep
He's muted.
I see that. There we go. Now it's working. So questions about, you know, what does a normal day look like for a maintenance worker? If they're visiting the site once a month, or maybe it's only a couple times during the season, what are those kind of very common activities that the maintenance workers are doing? How much effort does that require? How much training does that require? So maybe we'll kind of start there, and then a follow-up question was how to change the perception of how much maintenance is needed, because we saw in Stephanie's presentation, several people that responded to the survey thought that the maintenance was overwhelming. It was too much. It was unmaintainable for what I saw as relatively simple BMPs. So maybe start with what are common maintenance activities and what do we need to do? What's that level of effort and training that we need? And maybe how we can change the perceptions of the community and decision makers to be able to take on some of these, what I think are relatively simple tasks.
I think, sorry, I'll take it off your shoulders, Rusty. I think for me, one of the things is the view that plants are expensive, and my feeling is to overplant is an inexpensive way of controlling weeds, and it's also an aesthetic way of controlling weeds, because if you add those flowers, and Stephanie mentioned it too in the massings, it looks intentional, it conveys care and maintenance, and it also is good at suppressing weeds. And another maintenance activity that I think is something to consider is more shredded mulch, certainly in the upper part of the rain garden, not all the way down to the bottom, because of anaerobic issues there. But I think another thing to consider, is there a simple way to retrofit at the inlet some kind of very simple sump, so that we get more of that material, whether it's road sand or whether it's the grit from shingles, ending up in those rain gardens and doing what Stephanie had showed earlier, which is creating this big clogged area in the center. It's a simple fix, or it's a simple problem, and I think there are some simple fixes out there, and I think that I'd encourage people who are doing maintenance of these rain gardens to think about retrofitting small sumps in. If they inherited a rain garden and it didn't have it, just go ahead and start to do that at your inlet structures. And thank you.
Okay, I'll continue on that. What I require on all designs is that I understand who is going to be maintaining the garden first before I even design. So that there's a maintenance plan, operations and maintenance plan is created during the design phase. That we understand who's going to be maintaining it, and then changing the design for the maintenance. So sometimes the change in design is if you have the person that's going to be maintaining it doesn't know the difference between a pansy and a petunia, that's fine. But can they tell the difference between a shrub, a grass, and a flower? And if so, maybe you do it only in grasses or only in shrubs so that they can, wipe out the easy one. The other piece is that pre-treatment is huge. We've already mentioned it a couple times, and I think that's the biggest priority. And then once you've gotten that pre-treatment in long-term maintenance, it's about timing, not the amount of time that you spend in the garden. So, for instance, the first year, once you build it, you're going to have somebody going out there monthly. It's the first year is the hardest. You're going to end up going out there, making sure that there's no erosion, making sure that the inlets and outlets are working, functioning correctly. You're going to find if you've missed something, that there's something coming into your garden that you didn't expect from upstream. You're going to find those things, and you can do corrective actions. Then, and then that also allows the plants to get established without letting weeds get established. Then the second year, you might go in there bi-monthly. And the first time you go out there is when the dandelions turn yellow. So my trick to tell homeowners or gardeners to go is you start when the dandelions turn yellow. So here in New York, that's April. In Minnesota, it's May. Who in their right mind is going out to weed their garden in April? It's not very common, and it's hard to get people to think about it. But when the dandelions turn yellow, and you think about it biologically, the seeds germinate in 2 seasons, either cool season or warm season. The first seeds that germinate in the cool season that are when the soil temperature gets consistently 40 degrees, when your lawn turns green, the first weeds that germinate that get to flower that everyone can identify is dandelions. So dandelions is the first one. So when the dandelions start, then bi-monthly after that. Then third year and beyond, hopefully your garden is well established, you really should be able to get out there for weeding. You might want to go by and check, like Stephanie mentioned in her presentation, going out there more often to just do a drive-by, but really timing for plant material and weeding. And that's what most people think about, is the weeding is too hard and too complicated, and I don't know the difference between plants, is designing it so it's easy to identify, planting in big groups, in swaths, or what I call is the Sesame Street approach. The one that doesn't look like the others is the weed. And then timing, you get out there when the dandelions turn yellow, and then for the summer weeds, about Independence Day. So I kind of tell people, dandelions blooming yellow, Independence Day, maybe one more time in August and September, but 2 to 3 times maximum going out there to the weed. And then for me, you plant things tight so it looks more like a cottage garden, so that the plants are all touching together, so there's no space in between. The weeds don't have a chance to come in. So where the weeds do come in is usually at the entrance. So you get a few plants at the entrance. It's fast pulling, 5-10 minutes. You get those and you're done. And you don't need to add mulch over time. You've let the plants grow in tight and not have a chance for weeds to get in there. So that's kind of the A to Z, what I think about when I'm talking about maintenance.
That's great. Any other comments on inspections? Yeah, go ahead. You want to add to that too, Peter?
Yeah, I as a rule of thumb in these type of plants, we never go any further apart than 1 foot on center for perennial planting. Again, it might seem extreme, but the cost and effort to get somebody who understands what weeds look like is far greater than the capital cost, which is easier to get up front, of planting very heavily and going with that 1 foot on center with small plugs. And if you have a clump of 20 switchgrass, but they're 2 feet on center, then get another 20 and infill it, and you're gonna reduce your weed problems. And as I piggyback on what Rusty said about dandelions as being the indicator to get out and start controlling weeds then, because they grow so fast, those cool season weeds. They can grow a foot in a week, and it can look really bad very quickly. Before your warmer season, plants are starting to come up and fill in, and all people see are the weeds. So, thank you.
So I just
Stephanie,
want
go
to
ahead, yeah.
add a quick comment, and I think in part answer Peter's initial question to me about what I define as rock star plants. And I think it is situation specific. So maybe Vermont and Minnesota have a lot in common, because here the dandelions come and turn yellow in August. It's so cold. No, that's just kidding. It's actually also May in Vermont, not April like in New York City where you are, Rusty. But the switchgrass, I don't know yet. I've used it a lot. You saw it in a lot of my studies. But in terms of sort of the visual impact, it's very slow in a place that already has a short growing season to sort of seem lush and like exciting and interesting. And I think that's a challenge. And then if it's mixed in with a lot of other plants, so many of our weeds look like grasses that it's also one that's hard to tell people, oh no, this is an on-purpose grass. Those other ones you want to pull, but like it's a tough one from a maintenance standpoint. But I've wondered if the aesthetic of just sort of like all ornamental grasses or native ornamental grasses is one that's worth pursuing, maybe like in that tree and grass landscape, that it's perennials, but it's grasses you don't really need to mow, they're clumping grasses, and that might be appealing. But I really am partial to the flowering species. And in areas that are wetter, I said, yeah, maybe the sneezeweed, and the helenium is the sneezeweed, Helenium autumnale. I think in places that are consistently wetter, it's going to do better than long periods of drought, although it will probably survive, and it has in our projects. It just looks much better in some years than others. And that Baptisia I pointed out also fixes nitrogen. So I have another grant proposal in right now. If you're watching, funders, I really want to look at this to think about whether any nitrogen fixing plants might like mess with the nutrient dialogue in a good way or not. But it's done great in terms of thriving in the really challenging conditions. Same with the red twig dogwood, willows, but you have to be careful in some places because willows get into pipes. So there's so many plants, and I'd love to keep that piece of the conversation going. In terms of maintaining plants, Rusty's laid out like ideal maintenance regime. I fully support that idea of sort of what holidays to have correspond with when you do your weeding. It works really well, actually, in general. And I think that's just, let's see, there was something else about the rockstar species I wanted to mention. Yeah, so when you're choosing plants, and depending on the client and who you're working with, massing is really critical. And I agree with Peter that having the tight spacing is really important, but tight spacing and massing the same thing, so you can use that Rusty's Sesame Street rule. I think it was Rusty's, which one doesn't belong piece. Like if you're in a mix of, and sometimes cottage gardens are, sometimes they're not, but if you're in a mix of tons of biodiversity, which might seem really cool and wild and naturalistic, it can be really hard to discern which plants you might not want, especially in the early season. So the rock star versus, it's more like a rock concert than a ballet. I wanted to say that. Like it's gritty. It's like harsh lighting and like really, like you don't know if you're gonna get water or not. It's like really complicated. There's constant action. You know, so that's kind of the attitude you have to have with these plants. And as beautiful as some of the natives are, I showed some columbine earlier, it's so delicate. And of the original ones we planted, there's fewer than I would like. Also things like Joe Pye weed, butterfly milkweed, they're great for attracting pollinators. They work really well in the wet, dry issue, but you might have some microclimatic conditions, especially in the water tolerance, that are important to account for from site to site.
Go ahead, Rusty.
I would also consider the structure of the plant being the tougher guys like irises and sedges that can stand up to the speed of water and a little bit of abuse. Would maybe you put those right at the entrance where your crud is coming in, technical term there, crud, and the speed of the water, so they can handle bouncing back and survive those inlets.
Peter, go ahead.
I was going to add that some plants that are in my rock star list of these type of rain gardens and take just tough conditions are blue vervain, Verbena ostata, marsh milkweed, Joe Pye, ironweed, and blue flag iris. Those ones. There's a few others, of course, but I try to always have those in there in massings. Again, it looks intentional. It looks like we know what we're doing, and it's easier for a maintenance person to come in and say they all look the same. That's probably planted on purpose, and those plants in particular seem to be really durable.
That's great. So I know we're running on time. We're a little bit over right now, but we want to try to give the full hour for the panel. So maybe before we do our close, I want to do one more quick rapid fire discussion question, because it ties into this whole concept of or discussion on vegetation. And the question is, how would you change perceptions? So what kind of key statements would you give our audience that they can take to property owners? And maybe they're obviously not stormwater professionals. Maybe they are a property that has to maintain a bioretention practice and they have no idea. Maybe they're asking you questions like, well, do I have to be a botanist to be able to do this? Do I have to speak Latin and know all the Latin names for all of these vegetation species? So the question is, what would you tell someone to tell someone else to change the perception about bioretention maintenance? How is it more attainable for anyone?
I can go first if you want. Peter, you should go first.
Oh, okay. So one of the things that I like to encourage people to do that have any kind of facility like this is, when it's in flower, take a picture, send it to the local newspaper, and try to get them out there and take pictures of it. Because that type of good press builds a constituency. And I also recommend that if they do extra plantings, they try to involve volunteers, whether they're in the building or like an Eagles or a Scout group or a local garden club, because it builds a constituency and it builds support for these type of systems. And you look good in front of your boss if your project shows up on the local newspaper, colored photographs, and everybody feels good about it. Try to get those folks on your side. And when you meet them in the elevator for 2 or 3 minutes, you can say, well, this is what we did and why we did it. And they just check it off mentally, that box in their mind. We're good on rain gardens. They don't need to talk about this for another year.
Who would like to go next?
I can, I think everything that Peter said, agreed completely. Good press is really helpful. Before and after images are really helpful. I mean, I showed some that are simulations, but just so people actually have a visual on like the footprint of the system, for example, you could simulate that ahead of time, but once it's actually constructed, having a pre-post juxtaposition, a pair of images, I find has been really useful. The picture worth 1,000 words thing, where people hear about it, but then when they see it, it really makes a difference. And I do think working on seasonal variety, I mentioned having something that flowers or has some sort of winter interest in flowers throughout the growing season. Some species flowering, so it looks okay in the spring, it looks okay, or better than okay, in the spring, throughout the summer, into the fall. And then the winter interest, you can even have it so it just doesn't look like it's waiting and sitting there in the winter. With some pretty woody species, for example. But yeah, changing people's minds is really challenging. In the resident survey that we did, some of the slides I didn't have time for, pointed to for certain things like the downspout disconnect to a rain barrel. That was one of them. And also anyone who was purported to be willing to implement more than one GSI practice on the same site. Both of those corresponded with people who are driven by green behaviors. Like the idea that sort of like, oh, well, my neighbors drive a Prius, so I should too. Or that kind of like wanting to be green. And even in the face of like sometimes not believing it would work, they still wanted to do it. So that was a really interesting sort of social science finding about people's willingness on that topic.
Kate or Rusty, who would like to go next if you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add that oftentimes listening is actually much more effective at getting people to change their minds than telling. Somebody who says, I'm afraid it's going to be a lot of maintenance, saying why, and letting them really sort of unspool what that is. Some of their concerns will be very legitimate. Some of them will be things that we can respond to. But often it's just like, that's different. I'm not used to it. And helping people sort of walk through it by listening to them can be very, very effective.
I like everything that everyone else has said, and what I wanted to add is that, especially in Minnesota, letting folks know that when you're driving down the street, you're more than likely passing multiple rain gardens. My opinion is that the best rain gardens are the ones you can't tell are a rain garden after a year. Once you can't see the bottom anymore, when it's all full of plants, it's just a garden. And I'm going to tell you that, especially in Minnesota, you're going to drive by thousands of them going from one place to another and have no idea that those were rain gardens to begin with. And I think we should be taking pictures of them and showing. We're really good at taking pictures of the day they're being planted, and we're really good at taking the before pictures. We're terrible at taking pictures 3 years later. And I think those are the ones that we need to do a better job at showing off. And what I've noticed, because I really feel like I've started my whole career all over again here in New York, because nobody knew what a rain garden was, where in Minnesota, everyone knew what a rain garden was. It was really good to kind of start over again and really remember what were those arguments that I've had to deal with in the past and to get over those hurdles. And I'm going to tell you, there's always those first adopter people that are going to jump on the chance of, I'm going to make the world better, and I'm going to do it in my yard. And you got to pull them in and say, yeah, absolutely, let's make it work. And can we experiment a little bit and try something else? And those people are always willing to experiment. The next group of people, you do not experiment on. You do the things that you know are going to work every time and make it look great. And you got to kind of show what's going on. And what I have noticed is once you get a few people down the street, the others will start to follow. And especially if they start to see real benefits, like there's a little less water in the street on the big storm, or the corner doesn't flood as badly anymore, and all those other things. So I think we have to start building on that success. And I really like the idea of making sure that it's getting more and more press.
So then to close up this discussion, what I'd like to do is go around and we'll do the same order in which I introduced our panelists. And I'd like each to respond with their key takeaways. What key takeaways would you give our audience that they can use in their jobs? So what things can they do every day? And maybe that's tomorrow, maybe that's looking into the future a little bit further. But what can we do as professionals, stormwater professionals, in this realm to improve our water resources, our ecosystem health, and overall the quality of life? So Peter, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Andy. So a key takeaway for me was Stephanie talking about spot application of compost, very local, not this broad brush approach to covering lots of territory, and heavy planting as heavily as when you've planted it up and you think there's way too many plants, you're just about right. And I think that go easy on salt, try to use wet mixes, and if you see standing water in your basin, there's something wrong, and you can fix it quite easily. Some scarification often works. Again, put in some kind of a little sump or trap at the inlet to hold on to that sediment so that it's not damaging all that nice work that you're doing and all that water quality improvements you can do if you keep out the large particles and stop them from plugging the system up.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. Kate, what would you recommend to our audience for key takeaways?
I would say really think about exactly what problem you're trying to address and ranking what your interest in those different problems are if there are multiple issues to address, and doing that then in conjunction with thinking really carefully about what is your context, what pieces of this whole system need to be considered.
That's great, Kate. Rusty, what would be your key takeaways for our audience today?
Darn it, Kate, you stole it. Okay, so the other piece to add to Kate that we haven't touched on at all is test where you're going to be. I cannot believe how many people have tried to stuff the standard bioretention design into an area that has shallow groundwater or stuff. They're not thinking it through. They haven't tested the soil. They don't know the infiltration rate. They don't understand the drainage area and how much volume of water is coming, and they've designed it too small. Or they don't understand what is upstream and what are the pollutants coming to it. Not only nitrogen, phosphorus, and those things, but total suspended solids or sediment, or there's going to be a house constructed up the road. So test, and design correctly. And bioretention rain gardens are not a silver bullet. I consider them a silver BB. You shoot a whole bunch of them into a neighborhood, you're going to do a lot of good, but you cannot fix it with one garden at the end of the line. You have to start thinking distributing it across a small watershed and capturing small amounts of water. So test, distribute, go after the correct pollutant of issue, and then really make a maintenance plan before you even start. Don't build it and then think about the maintenance plan. Have a plan. If you don't have maintenance and you don't have a maintenance plan, don't build it, because if it's not going to be maintained, that one bad weedy garden is going to cause more problems than the 10 amazing ones down the street. And so and then the last piece is we got to keep doing this. We need more and more research going on. I try to keep up with what's going on in the research, because there's something coming out monthly, it seems like. And the more that we understand, and then we can add to the practices and then watch it. So I love the idea of putting in compost and just around the plant. That's new for me, and I'm going to be trying it and watching it. So those are things that I think are important.
Those are great words, Rusty. And to close the loop, we're going to give Stephanie the last word. So what kind of key takeaways would you recommend to our audience, Stephanie?
Those were all great. I will try to be brief. I have a few, one sort of on the micro scale, but super important when you're looking at amendments or any other kind of design implementation to try to counteract a pollutant. Very much like Kate said, she stole my words too. But basically, like, know what you're going after and what the purpose of every ingredient is. But also be aware when you read the literature and when you work with folks that labs using different methods will come out with different results. So I didn't mention this in the main body of my talk, but like I know in Minnesota, a lot of folks, I think in the Midwest in general, use the Mehlich 3 method for extracting nutrients, but we use the modified Morgan's in New England, and New York is the Morgan's method. And you can have an order of magnitude different specification. If I used exactly what Minnesota said as my target spec, but tested with a different method in the lab, I would get completely different nutrient data. So that's just one example. So the testing method matters. Also true, I showed some slides on drinking water treatment residuals. Depending on how you study them, you will get totally different numbers, and specifications need to like prescribe. You can use these tests, and this is your range of numbers that are appropriate. These lab methods, these ranges. Not try to just use the range without the methods. On the macro scale, the assumptions about modeling, which was brought up earlier, just assuming like, yes, if you put 20 bioretention in, you're gonna clean up this watershed. What are the ingredients of the bioretention? Where are they located? Is there infiltration? Is there an underdrain? And it matters. It's kind of challenging if you're doing broad hydrologic or water quality monitoring and modeling to get to all those points. And so, modeling, the lab methods, compost, drinking water treatment residuals, even topsoil, those words mean different things to different people. They have different ingredients. They have different sort of characteristics and attributes depending on what you're looking for. Don't just say compost if you actually mean leaf litter compost, or if you mean compost that contains no more than 30% of biosolids or 20% of food scraps, or whatever you mean. That needs to be really clear in specifications. Maintenance, think about assigning maintenance for the gardening, the plumbing, and kind of the general maintenance and trash removal side of things. Like the plumbing matters, the hardscape that's in these bioretention systems, you don't maintain the same way you would have a crew go out and pull weeds. So either train someone to do all of them, or really like break down your maintenance into different sort of scopes of who can do what, when, and how often. And then choose the rockstar plants for your microclimate and your design goals. I think that's a really big one. Make your own list of what your rockstar plants are. And design matters. That's the bottom line. Design matters at the watershed scale. It matters at the local scale. It matters on residential sites, commercial sites, institutional sites. So really don't forget to have that design thinking as you implement these systems, or if you're working on monitoring them as a scientist studying them, that matters there too.
That's great, Stephanie. So to close, I would like to thank our panelists. Thank you all for joining today. Obviously, I would like to also thank Stephanie for giving our keynote and providing the basis for this discussion. Yes, let's have a round of applause for everybody here. Very good. Thank you.